Section 41 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 8. But apart from this, had the portrait been not anterior, like Swann's favorite photograph, to the systematization of Odette's features in a fresh type, majestic and charming, but subsequent to it, Elster's version would alone have sufficed to disorganize that type. Artistic genius in its reactions is like those extremely high temperatures which have the power to disintegrate combinations of atoms which they proceed to combine afresh in a diametrically opposite order, following another type. All that artificially harmonious whole into which a woman has succeeded in bringing her limbs and features, the persistence of which every day before going out she studies in her glass, changing the angle of her hat, smoothing her hair, exercising the sprightliness in her eyes, so as to ensure its continuity. That harmony the keen eye of the great painter instantly destroys, substituting for it a rearrangement of that woman's features, such as will satisfy a certain pictorial ideal of femininity which he carries in his head. Similarly, it often happens that after a certain age, the eye of a great seeker after truth will find everywhere the elements necessary to establish those relations which alone are of interest to him. Like those craftsmen, those players who, instead of making a fuss and asking for what they cannot have, content themselves with the instrument that comes to their hand, the artist might say of anything, no matter what, that it would serve his purpose. Thus, a cousin of the Princess de Luxembourg, a beauty of the most queenly type, having succumbed to a form of art which was new at that time, had asked the leading painter of the naturalist school to do her portrait. At once the artist's eye had found what he sought everywhere in life, and on his canvas there appeared, in place of the proud lady, a street boy, and behind him a vast sloping purple background which made one think of the Place Pigalle. But even without going so far as that, not only will the portrait of a woman by a great artist not seek in the least to give satisfaction to various demands on the woman's part, such as, for instance, when she begins to age, make her have herself photographed in dresses that are almost those of a young girl, which bring out her still youthful figure and make her appear like the sister, or even the daughter of her own daughter, who if need be is tricked out for the occasion as a perfect fright by her side. It will, on the contrary, emphasize those very drawbacks which she seeks to hide, and which, as for instance a feverish, that is to say a livid complexion, are all the more tempting to him since they give his picture character. They are quite enough, however, to destroy all the illusions of the ordinary man, who, when he sees the picture, sees crumble into dust the ideal which the woman herself has so proudly sustained for him, which has placed her, in her unique, her unalterable form, so far apart, so far above the rest of humanity. Fallen now, represented otherwise than in her own type in which she sat unassailably throned, she has become nothing more than just an ordinary woman, in the legend of whose superiority we have lost all faith. In this type we are so accustomed to regard as included not only the beauty of an Odette, but her personality, her identity, that standing before the portrait which has thus transposed her from it, we are inclined to protest not simply how plain he has made her, but why it isn't the least bit like her. We find it hard to believe that it can be she. We do not recognize her, and yet there is a person there on the canvas whom we are quite conscious of having seen before. But that person is not Odette. The face of the person, her body, her general appearance seem familiar. They recall to us not this particular woman who never held herself like that, whose natural pose had no suggestion of any such strange and teasing arabesque in its outlines, but other women, all the women whom Elster has ever painted, women whom invariably, however they may differ from one another, he has chosen to plant thus on his canvas facing you, with an arched foot thrust out from under the skirt, a large round hat in one hand, symmetrically corresponding at the level of the knee which it hides to what also appears as a disc higher up in the picture, the face. And furthermore, not only does a portrait by the hand of genius disintegrate and destroy a woman's type, as it has been defined by her coquetry and her selfish conception of beauty, But if it is also old, it is not content with aging the original in the same way as a photograph ages its sitter, by showing her dressed in the fashions of long ago. In a portrait, it is not only the manner the woman then had of dressing that dates it, there is also the manner the artist had of painting. And this, Elster's earliest manner, was the most damaging of birth certificates for Odette, because it not only established her, as did her photographs of the same period, as the younger sister of various time-honored courtesans, but made her portrait contemporary with the countless portraits that Manet or Whistler had painted of all those vanished models who already belonged to oblivion or to history. It was along this train of thought, meditated in silence by the side of Elster, as I accompanied him to his door, that I was being led by the discovery that I had just made of the identity of his model, when this original discovery caused me to make a second, more disturbing still, involving the identity of the artist. He had painted the portrait of Odette de Crécy. Could it possibly be that this man of genius, this sage, this eremite, this philosopher with his marvelous flow of conversation, who towered over every one and everything, was the foolish, corrupt little painter who had at one time been taken up by the Verdurin? I asked him if he had known them, whether by any chance it was he that they used to call Monsieur Biche. He answered me in the affirmative, with no trace of embarrassment, as if my question referred to a period in his life that was ended and already somewhat remote, with no suspicion of what a cherished illusion his words were shattering in me, until looking up he read my disappointment upon my face. His own assumed an expression of annoyance, and, as we were now almost at the gate of his house, a man of less outstanding eminence in heart and brain might simply have said good-bye to me, a trifle dryly, and taken care to avoid seeing me again. This, however, was not Elster's way with me, like the master that he was, and this was, perhaps, from the point of view of sheer creative genius, his one fault, that he was a master in that sense of the word, for an artist, if he is to live the true life of the spirit in its full extent, must be alone and not bestow himself with profusion, even upon disciples, from every circumstance, whether involving himself or other people, he sought to extract, for the better edification of the young, the element of truth that it contained. He chose, therefore, rather than say anything that might have avenged the injury to his pride, to say what he thought would prove instructive to me. "There is no man," he began, "however wise, who has not at some period of his youth said things or lived in a way the consciousness of which is so unpleasant to him in later life that he would gladly, if he could, expunge it from his memory. And yet he ought not entirely to regret it, because he cannot be certain that he has indeed become a wise man, so far as it is possible for any of us to be wise, unless he has passed through all the fatuous or unwholesome incarnations by which that ultimate stage must be preceded. I know that there are young fellows, the sons and grandsons of famous men, whose masters have instilled into them nobility of mind and moral refinement in their school days. They have, perhaps, when they look back upon their past lives, nothing to retract. They can, if they choose, publish a signed account of everything they have ever said or done, but they are poor creatures, feeble descendants of doctrinaires, and their wisdom is negative and sterile. We are not provided with wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves, after a journey through the wilderness which no one else can take for us, an effort which no one can spare us, for our wisdom is the point of view from which we come at last to regard the world. The lives that you admire, the attitudes that seem noble to you, are not the result of training at home, by a father, or by masters at school. They have sprung from beginnings of a very different order, by reaction from the influence of everything evil or commonplace that prevailed round about them. They represent a struggle and a victory. I can see that the picture of what we once were in early youth may not be recognizable and cannot certainly be pleasing to contemplate in later life. But we must not deny the truth of it, for it is evidence that we have really lived, that it is in accordance with the laws of life and of the mind that we have, from the common elements of the life of studios, of artistic groups, assuming that one is a painter, extracted something that goes beyond them. Meanwhile, we had reached his door. I was disappointed in not having met the girls, but after all, there was now the possibility of meeting them again later on. They had ceased to do no more than pass beyond a horizon on which I had been ready to suppose that I should never see them reappear. Around them no longer swirled that sort of great eddy which had separated me from them, which had been merely the expression of the perpetually active desire, mobile, compelling, fed ever on fresh anxieties, which was aroused in me by their inaccessibility, their flight from me, possibly forever. My desire for them I could now set it at rest, hold it in reserve, among all those other desires, the realization of which, as soon as I knew it to be possible, I would cheerfully postpone. I took leave of Elster. I was alone once again. Then all of a sudden, despite my recent disappointment, I saw in my mind's eye all that chain of coincidence which I had not supposed could possibly come about. That Elster should be a friend of those very girls, that they who only that morning had been to me merely figures in a picture with the sea for the background had seen me walking in friendly intimacy with a great painter, who was now informed of my secret longing and would no doubt do what he could to assuage it. All this had been a source of pleasure to me, but that pleasure had remained hidden. It was one of those visitors who wait before letting us know that they are in the room until all the rest have gone and we are by ourselves. Then only do we catch sight of them, and can say to them, "I am at your service," and listen to what they have to tell us. Sometimes between the moment at which these pleasures have entered our consciousness and the moment at which we are free to entertain them, so many hours have passed. We have in the interval seen so many people that we are afraid lest they should have grown tired of waiting. But they are patient, they do not grow tired, and as soon as the crowd has gone, we find them there ready for us. Sometimes it is then, we who are so exhausted that it seems as though our weary mind will not have the strength left to seize and retain those memories, those impressions for which our frail self is the one habitable place, the sole means of realization. And we should regret that failure, for existence to us is hardly interesting save on the days on which the dust of realities is shot with magic sand, on which some trivial incident of life becomes a spring of romance. Then a whole promontory of the inaccessible world rises dear in the light of our dream and enters into our life in which, like the sleeper awakened, we actually see the people of whom we have been so ardently dreaming, that we came to believe that we should never behold them, save in our dreams. The sense of comfort that I drew from the probability of my now being able to meet the little band whenever I chose was all the more precious to me, because I should not have been able to keep watch for them during the next few days, which would be taken up with preparations for St. Loup's departure. My grandmother was anxious to offer my friend some proof of her gratitude for all the kindnesses he had shown to her and myself. I told her that he was a great admirer of Proudhon, and this put it into her head to send for a collection of autograph letters by that philosopher which she had once bought. St. Loup came to her room to look at them on the day of their arrival, which was also his last day at Baalbec. He read them eagerly, fingering each page with reverence, trying to get the sentences by heart, and then, rising from the table, was beginning to apologize to my grandmother for having stayed so long, when he heard her say, "No, no. Take them with you. They are for you to keep. That was why I sent for them, to give them to you." He was overpowered by a joy which he could no more control than we can a physical condition that arises without the intervention of our will. He blushed scarlet as a child who has just been whipped, and my grandmother was a great deal more touched to see all the efforts that he was making, without success, to control the joy that convulsed him than she would have been to hear any words of thanks that he could have uttered. But he, fearing that he had failed to show his gratitude properly, begged me to make his excuses to her again, next day, leaning from the window of the little train of the local railway company which was to take him back to his regiment. The distance was, as a matter of fact, nothing. He had thought of going, as he had frequently done that summer, when he was to return the same evening and was not encumbered with luggage, by road. But this time he would have had, anyhow, to put all his heavy luggage in the train. And he found it simpler to take the train himself also, following the advice of the manager, who on being consulted replied that carriage or train it was more or less equivocal. He meant us to understand that they were equivalent, in fact very much what Francois would have expressed as coming to as near as made no difference. Very well, St. Loup had decided, I will take the little crawler. I should have taken it too, had I not been tired, and gone with my friend to Doncières. Failing this, I kept on promising, all the time that we waited in the Baalbec station, the time, that is to say, which the driver of the little train spent in waiting for unpunctual friends, without whom he refused to start, and also in seeking some refreshment for himself, to go over there and see him several times a week, as Bloch had come to the station also, much to St. Loup's disgust. The latter, seeing that our companion could hear him begging me to come to luncheon, to dinner, to stay altogether at Doncières, finally turned to him and in the most forbidding tone intended to counteract the forced civility of the invitation and to prevent Bloch from taking it seriously. "If you ever happen to be passing through Doncières any afternoon when I am off duty, you might ask for me at the barracks, but I hardly ever am off duty." Perhaps also Robert felt lest, if left to myself, I might not come, and thinking that I was more intimate with Bloch than I made out, was providing me in this way with a traveling companion, one who would urge me on. I was afraid that this tone, this way of inviting a person while warning him not to come, might have wounded Bloch, and felt that St. Loup would have done better saying nothing. But I was mistaken, for after the train had gone, while we were walking back together as far as the crossroads at which we should have to part, one road going to the hotel, the other to the Bloch's villa, he never ceased from asking me on what day we should go to Doncières, for after all the civilities that St. Loup had shown him, it would be too unmannerly on his part not to accept the invitation. I was glad that he had not noticed, or was so little displeased as to wish to let it be thought that he had not noticed on how far from pressing, how barely polite a note the invitation had been sounded. At the same time I should have liked Bloch, for his own sake, to refrain from making a fool of himself by going over at once to Doncières. But I dared not offer a piece of advice which could only have offended him by hinting that St. Loup had been less pressing than himself impressed. He was a great deal too ready to respond, and even if all his faults of this nature were atoned for by remarkable qualities which others, with more reserve than he, would not possess, he carried indiscretion to a pitch that was almost maddening. The week must not, to hear him speak, pass without our going to Doncières. He said our, for I think that he counted to some extent on my presence there as an excuse for his own. All the way home, opposite the gymnasium in its grove of trees, opposite the lawn tennis courts, the mayor's office, the shellfish stall, he stopped me, imploring me to fix a day, and as I did not, left me in a towering rage, saying, "As your lordship pleases. For my part, I am obliged to go, since he has invited me." St. Loup was still so much afraid of not having thanked my grandmother properly that he charged me once again to express his gratitude to her a day or two later in a letter I received from him from the town in which he was quartered, a town which seemed, on the envelope where the postmark had stamped its name, to be hastening to me across country, to tell me that within its walls, in the Louis XVI cavalry barracks, he was thinking of me. The paper was embossed with the arms of Marcel, in which I could make out a lion, surmounted by a coronet formed by the cap of a peer of France. After a journey which, he wrote, passed pleasantly enough, with a book I bought at the station by Arvade Barin, a Russian author, I fancy. It seemed to me remarkably well written for a foreigner, but you shall give me your critical opinion. You are bound to know all about it, you fount of knowledge who have read everything. Here I am again in the thick of this debased existence, where, alas, I feel a sad exile, not having here what I had to leave at Balbec. This life in which I cannot discover one affectionate memory, any intellectual attraction, an environment on which you would probably look with contempt, and yet it has a certain charm. Everything seems to have changed since I was last here, for in the interval one of the most important periods in my life, that from which our friendship dates, has begun. I hope that it may never come to an end. I have spoken of our friendship, of you, to one person only, to the friend I told you of, who has just paid me a surprise visit here. She would like immensely to know you, and I feel that you would get on well together, for she, too, is extremely literary. I, on the other hand, to go over in my mind all our talk, to live over again those hours which I shall never forget, have shut myself off from my comrades. Excellent fellows, but altogether incapable of understanding that sort of thing. This remembrance of moments spent with you I should almost have preferred, on my first day here, to call up for my own solitary enjoyment without writing. But I was afraid lest you, with your subtle mind and ultra-sensitive heart, might, if you did not hear from me, needlessly torment yourself, if, that is to say, you still condescend to occupy your thoughts with this blunt trooper whom you will have a hard task to polish and refine, and make a little more subtle and worthier of your company. On the whole, this letter, in its affectionate spirit, was not at all unlike those which, when I did not yet know Saint Loup, I had imagined that he would write to me, in those daydreams from which the coldness of his first greeting had shaken me by bringing me face to face with an icy reality which was not, however, to endure. Once I had received this letter, whenever at luncheon time the post was brought in, I could tell at once, when it was from him that a letter came, for it had always that second face which a person assumes when he is absent, in the features of which, the characters of his script, there is no reason why we should not suppose that we are tracing an individual soul just as much as in the line of a nose or the inflections of a voice. I would now gladly remain at the table while it was being cleared, and if it was not a moment at which the girls of the little band might be passing, it was no longer solely towards the sea that I would turn my eyes. Since I had seen such things depicted in watercolors by Elster, I sought to find again in reality. I cherished, as though for their poetic beauty, the broken gestures of the knives still lying across one another, the swollen convexity of a discarded napkin upon which the sun would patch a scrap of yellow velvet, the half-empty glass which thus showed to greater advantage the noble sweep of its curved sides, and in the heart of its translucent crystal, clear as frozen daylight, a dreg of wine, dusky but sparkling with reflected lights, the displacement of solid objects, the transmutation of liquids by the effect of light and shade, the shifting color of the plums which passed from green to blue and from blue to golden yellow in the half-plundered dish, the chairs, like a group of old ladies that came twice daily to take their places round the white cloth spread on the table as on an altar at which were celebrated the rites of the palate, where in the hollows of oyster shells a few drops of lustral water had gathered as in tiny, holy water stoups of stone. I tried to find beauty there where I had never imagined before that it could exist, in the most ordinary things, in the profundities of still life. End of section 41.